It is happening. Welcome to Demystifying Pattern Libraries in Drupal 8 with me. I'm Zakiya, and I am a senior Drupal developer at Chapter 3. I would have gotten to it either way, so we are recording. Just about me, if you want to contact me after this, I'm at Zakiya Designs on Twitter. I feel like I didn't spend enough time promoting the Drupal Twig Slack this week, but if you're a front-ender, it's a very good resource. Some very smart people are in there. I've been doing Drupal since 2007. I've been at Chapter 3 since 2015. Chapter 3 is a Drupal shop in San Francisco, downtown, near the ballpark. And lastly, I'm not an expert on pattern libraries. I actually hadn't touched one about 2 months before today until I started prepping for this again. But I had done this talk before, and I think the information is still useful. So if you see anything you want to change, update, I am open to that. Feel free to let the group know and be collaborative. So just to get a sort of sense, how many people went to Israel's talk on pattern libraries earlier this week? So only a couple. What about Brian's talk about UI patterns? I think Brian did. So not everyone has seen all this before. How many have actually built a site that's used a pattern library? About half. Okay. So are there any questions before I get started, like sort of burning questions you've had about pattern libraries generally, Pattern Lab at Drupal 8, anything like that? All right. Okay, so just a little bit about this talk and like where it's coming from. It is sort of on the beginner level. If you've done a bunch of pattern libraries, you're probably not going to see, or use Pattern Lab a lot, you're not going to see anything super new. For those who haven't touched them, the idea behind this talk was to sort of get people's head around Pattern Lab ecosystem and what's available out there, so you can make good decisions, informed decisions. If you, I'm going to show a little code, but not a ton, so you'll get to see the guts a little bit to see how things connect to one another. Most of this is just general information for everybody. There were 2 other sessions, like I mentioned, this weekend. They'll be online, and I know slides are up for them as well. Okay, so just so we're all on the same page, when we first started jumping into the waters with pattern libraries, there was a lot of confusion about the difference between a pattern library and Pattern Lab, which is a specific tool. So in general, when I use the word library, I'm talking generically, and you might also hear it called an interactive comp or a living style guide or a component library. Unlike a regular comp, like that you would make in Photoshop or Sketch, you can see things like user interactions, slideshows, navigation, hover effects, etc. So this is why marketing teams love them, clients love them generally, designers like them. So why are they so popular? Especially if on big systems, there's a single source of design truth. You can have a pure separation between front end and back end, at least theoretically. You can reuse elements easily, at least theoretically. And you can work out your naming conventions earlier. You can have a shorter feedback loop between designers and actually implementing the whole site with its whole back end and everything that comes with it. If you're using a tool like some of the front-end JavaScript frameworks, it's almost a requirement having sort of working out these things. So here's a list of some examples. I wanted to keep my time. Okay. You can look them up. I'm going to post these slides. I won't go into them too much because I think most people have seen them, but these are just ones that are out in the wild. They're public, open source. I'll show one just so in case there's someone who's never seen one. We'll do Starbucks. And you can see it's just basically, is this one still working? All the sort of parts that would ever exist on their site have been worked out, and the code's there, and you can see what they look like in their hover state, and you can see what they look like responsively. That's the idea behind a pattern library. So use case, usually companies with a lot of multiple digital assets, they're sending data to, a phone or, like a native app and a website and maybe some other system like a kiosk or something like that. And they want to maintain brand consistency. Super large sites where things sort of go out of control, where you've made the same button 4 times with different things. The pattern library can be helpful. Anything with strong branding guidelines, and any site with the budget to make it happen. Which brings me to the pros and cons of using a pattern library. I think when I first started hearing about them, I would only hear the pros. My personality, I want to know the cons, so here they are. But for developers, it is kind of fun, especially if you've been in Drupal for a long time, to be able to write a front end without Drupal dividus and all the other fun things that come with Drupal. But on the negative side, there are a lot of moving parts with most of these pattern library and Drupal integrations, and therefore some multiple points of failure. For another thing for Drupal devs, it's just you have to be more accessibility minded than usual, because Drupal gives you so many things already built. If you're building your entire front end from scratch using a pattern lab, then you have to sort of be a little more conscious of that. For site owners, I think also kind of fun. I think they like seeing what their site's going to be earlier on. And if used properly, they have a lot of more brand control instead of designers coming up with new iterations all the time. But it can be more hours and more money, more resources to put together a system like the ones I'll be discussing. For designers, if they're involved in the process, I think it encourages them to think in components as opposed to thinking of page layout, page layout, page layout. So you don't have those things where they're like, you know what, I've done this same button 6 times, and on the 7th time, I'm just going to go crazy. It's like the pattern library sort of thing just encourages consistency. You can certainly do it without using pattern libraries, but this sort of makes it a necessity. So I'm going to talk a little bit about pattern builders for a second, just to give a shout out and a mention in case you've heard of them. Has anyone ever used SASstock? This one will use your comments in your SAS files in order to automatically generate a documentation, and it has a little bit of UI. Fractal, has anyone used Fractal? This one? It has a certain amount of popularity. You'll definitely see it out in the wild, but I think most people who were using Fractal have moved to Pattern Lab, which I'll be discussing for the majority. And Astrum's just one I just recently heard about. Anyone heard of that one? Anybody use one that I haven't mentioned?
KSS Node?
KSS Node, correct. So these are, I think KSS Node and Pattern Lab are sort of the next generation beyond Fractal and SASstock and those. I would say, and then Storybook is sort of a React tool. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on Pattern Lab because that's the one that's sort of most popular in Drupal and the one that comes to us more from clients of them saying specifically we want to use Pattern Lab. And again, that's just one pattern library tool, but because of the way a lot of the features it has and the way it's implemented and the fact that it uses Twig makes it really not easy, but possible to integrate it with your Drupal site. Just a bit on KSS Node. This is what it looks like. Again, it's a good tool. There's, Media Current has their theme generator based on this, and it's a little bit simpler than Pattern Lab to put together. So Pattern Lab itself, I'm going to show it more. It has, I think the reason why it sort of won this little battle of the libraries is that it has a really nice UI and it's got these cute little responsive things. And it was also built by Brad Frost, who was the author of the book Atomic Design, which is where a lot of these principles come from. Plot twist. So this is worth knowing about if you're interested in this world. How many people have used Gatsby or are thinking about using Gatsby? You know, it's like, it's definitely, you can see its presence at this conference this weekend. It's like, it's the new thing. Brad Frost, instead of making another Pattern Lab iteration, and I have no idea what the thinking behind this work is, his next thing, or what has recently been made, is Style Guide Gatsby Edition. Style Guide Gatsby Edition. So it looks very similar to Pattern Lab in some ways, but it's specifically for React. So what that means for the future, I have no idea. But it's interesting that the person who was the architect of like the most popular system is now like, I'm going to do this other thing. Do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah.
They're also supposedly working on a Pattern Lab version, a future version that's going to be
work with Gatsby, or with
in general.
Oh, with React. Okay, cool. So that's what's happening. That may be next year's talk. We'll see. So what is atomic design? People are probably familiar with this. Anyone never heard of atomic design? Never heard of it? Okay, everyone's at least heard of it. Great. So yeah, it's the idea of breaking up your design into components that can be reused and built on top of. So you can see the blog post. This is an example for a site I worked on from a site, UCSF's alumni site. You can see an atom is then used to be incorporated in a molecule, is then used to be incorporated in an organism, and then there's also a template that can have everything, etc. So there's a lot of what I call like contrib patterns lab projects, pattern library projects that are out there, and sometimes I get some version of the question, which one of them should I use? I never answer questions like that straightforwardly, but I'll give you some information about how I make those decisions. Actually, I don't want to go to this slide yet. Let's move this down. Okay. So these are the ones that I'm aware of that integrate Drupal with a pattern library. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them. How many? So the ones I think people are most familiar with are Emulsify and Gesso, probably. Does anyone use Bearskin? What about KSS Bootstrap? Well, how about Emulsify? No. Gesso? No. Are people building their own when you're using Pattern Lab with Drupal? You're like using, okay, so my people. Great, interesting. That's really interesting. I thought I'd hear a lot more Emulsify and Gesso folks. So this is a spreadsheet I made because I was doing this talk and that's how my brain works. And this is available, what is that nonsense? What have you done to me, Google? Okay, we're just gonna pretend that's not there. I have no idea.
You design better.
Oh, in case I wanted to make a pivot table. Okay, thanks. Great.
No, I'm not trying to do that.
But now I am really sure that, like, if I wanted to, I could do it in Google. All this is like I took all the Pattern Lab projects or Pattern Library projects, including, and the last two are, these are Pattern Lab editions, and compared their feature sets. Like, so who it's developed by, what it uses for data, when the last commit was, which I think is a pretty valuable tool when you evaluate these things, and what their what makes them different from one another, what they do and do not do. where they're hosted, etc. So if you're interested, you can refer to this. I have been asked to share it a couple times, so I guess it's useful. One of the thing that's most important about it, I think, or to consider, is that there are certain plugins that some of them have and some of them don't have that are for Pattern Lab that can make your life a lot easier if you're using these tools together. Definitely Drupal Twig components. Well, they're all listed here, and I'll go through them more in the list. But I also, again, spreadsheet, because that's how I work. The ones that I would absolutely use, the ones I would use conditionally, and the ones I would never use are listed there for you. And I'll talk about each one some more. And then as far as starter kits, there's 5 Pattern Lab starter kits. I use the Drupal minimal. Yeah. Okay. And why this is important is, well, let's go back to the thing. Okay, so all these projects, all the ones that I listed, they are opinionated. They can be daunting if you don't understand the underlying technologies. And they all have sort of lots of moving parts, NPM, Yarn, Yeoman, Composer, Gulp, Webpack. And depending on your feelings about any one of those tools, you may or may not want to use that particular project. And they all have a learning curve of their own, on top of the learning curve of working with Drupal and Pattern Lab together. So just buyer beware with those. Being opinionated, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. It can be a very good thing if you're working with a big team and you don't want to go through all this, and you are this is using the things you want, then that is great. Like I said, so how do you decide the tools you want to avoid and embrace? Who the maintainer is? Are they still maintaining it? Not the case with all of those projects. Likelihood of something being deprecated. What does your team look like? If you have a team where everyone is pretty much like a senior, like a chapter 3, we're kind of all senior front-end developers who do front-end, and so we don't need to worry about passing off a hard-to-use tool to someone else, right? Whereas if you have a lot of junior people, it might be really nice to just pass them something that's very opinionated. And I think regardless of what tool you choose or whether you build your own, the idea of having a champion of the pattern library ecosystem is really important, because they are a bit to maintain, because you can, if you're feeling lazy, decide to just do everything directly in the Drupal theme and cut off the Pattern Lab. You really have to have a mentality in your team and with your and with who your project managers are, that maintaining the Pattern Lab and the Drupal site together are both important. Just a bit about the Pattern Lab ecosystem. So this is specifically what lives on the Pattern Lab website, patternlab.io. This is where I got this information from. Because you'll hear mention of additions, plugins, and starter kits, right? And which one you use matters. So the additions are technology specific. So Pattern Labs exists for Node, for Gulp, for Grunt, and for Drupal and other things, right? They all have the option of choosing a starter kit from them, right? So there are quick boilerplates that have done a little bit of work to get you going. You can choose not to. You can use an addition without a starter kit and go completely from scratch. And then you can add plugins, right? Which, like Drupal modules, they add specific functionality. Some of them were on that spreadsheet. I'm going to talk about them more specifically in a second. And if you want to know more about that, check patternlab.io. But really, people want to know which one of these should I use. So for me, what we do, or what we did at Chapter 3, is we started with Pattern Labs Drupal Standard Edition. I guess I lied earlier. On installation, there's an option to make sure you merge files. If you don't catch that little piece on the installation of the Pattern Lab following their instructions, you can always add those plugins later. They're Drupal-specific plugins. and use the plugins that you want. Whatever your approach is, just know that it's going to be a little more work than doing a standalone theme, but at the same time, if you use someone else's, then you still kind of have to learn it a little bit in order to be able to use it. All the contrib projects that I've discussed require Drupal's components module. You should probably be using that anyway if you're doing front-end work. One note on that is make sure no other themes or modules are using the same namespace as yours. Like for instance, on the demo site I'm about to show, I had installed like every version of Pattern Lab, and so when I tried to make my own, it was like, oh, you've already used that namespace. Like, so make sure you're creating your own namespace. They all require Composer, so if you're not on the Composer train, you're going to be sad. Although I'm not sure how you're using Drupal anymore without it. They all require Gulp, so there's usually some sort of task runner. And it's important to remember that these are starter kits, not base themes, right? So this would, if you're in this world, you're not going to be sub-theming Gesso. You're not going to be sub-theming Emulsify. You're going to be using them as a starter kit and modifying it on your own. So like if you're on Drupal.org and you're trying to evaluate that, and if you're looking for the statistics of how much usage, it might not be in there because chances are it's not like going to be, it might be modified when it's actually installed on a production site, like so that it's not reporting as a project because it's a starter kit. So this is just in here to sort of provoke the brain. There is theoretically a way to do this integration with Pattern Lab where you use Drupal as the one true source of truth, and you send all your data to the pattern library. So like if you're already a Drupal developer and you already have a Drupal site and you really want to like develop a pattern library or pattern lab out of that, you could do it. That would actually not be very much work for a Drupal dev, but that's usually not the use case, right? Like that Drupal would be the original source of all this design data. What's more common is that the pattern lab is the source of truth, and Drupal consumes all the files, either using the components module or a gulp task, and they're modified for Drupal use. So that's just the way it is. Talking about what about a particular module? There used to sort of be more sort of floating around there that were like people like, why should I use this module for pattern library? Should I use that? Right now, the only one that's sort of still standing is the UI patterns module. A nice thing about it, what it allows you to do is sort of through the Drupal UI connect patterns to your Drupal site, so sort of use it as a site building tool as opposed to purely a code tool. And the nice thing about that is you can turn some of the pattern work over to site builders. We haven't found a really good use case like in our shop for using this module, but that's the goal behind this. In like the Drupal Twig Slack, you'll often hear people saying like they're trying to get UI patterns to work with Pattern Lab, blah, 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 and all this, and they don't quite understand the relationship between all these things. So I would say if you're thinking about using this module, good on you, but what you should do first is understand how the Pattern Lab itself is working with Drupal, and then add on the extra layer of the UI tool to help folks make use of it. Okay, so how does Pattern Lab work with Drupal? Well, this is just Pattern Lab on its own. For anyone who hasn't looked at the code, however you get it, you can either pull it from Git or pull it from Composer. You're going to end up with a folder that's called Pattern Lab in the root, although one of the contrib projects renames it. You're going to have let me go over there, sorry, recording. A public folder, and that's where what's being read, that's what actually gets sent to the browser. That's what the browser sees. And then your source folder is where you do all your work. That's where you type, that's where you modify your Twig files, that's where you write your CSS, etc. And then everything else we're just calling magic. That's Pattern Lab doing its thing, right? From a high level, and like I said, every you can, because one of the things that I think is challenging is that you can change the configuration of Pattern Lab and the configuration of Drupal to such an extent that it wouldn't follow that you can move those folders in different places, you can do whatever you want, and you have a lot of ability to decide where to put your CSS files and how you want them consumed, same with the JavaScript. But in its simplest terms, in the simplest implementation, what happens is, oh yeah, I have this. You have your Sass partials. You use the same task runner that you probably already used in your Drupal theme root, and it can be Gulp or Webpack or whatever you're into, but Gulp's, I think, probably the best for this tool, for this situation. That generates a style.css file. It's consumed by both the Drupal theme and the Pattern Lab. They both look at the same CSS file and read them, and it can be the same way with the JavaScript. And in the standard case, that file lives inside the Pattern Lab, like your Sass and your resulting CSS would live inside the Pattern Lab. However, you have the ability to change that. Like you could decide to do something else because they're set in the head of the twig inside the Pattern Lab and just in normal sites library file or your themes library file. Having said that, if you're doing a truly like componentized situation where you're only including the CSS that you need per component and then you're only including the JavaScript that you need per component, that gets a lot more complicated. But that work isn't Pattern Lab specific. That is up to you as to how you want to write those Gulp files, right? So for the twig files, what happens is the Pattern Lab has these partials, and again, I'm going to show these in a second, and using an include statement, and you have to have the components module enabled, then your Drupal theme consumes the twig files from the Pattern Lab. Let me take a break. I was going to do the demo. Oh, actually, I'm at the demo, so fine. I probably should have showed this a little earlier. So let's actually look at what we're talking about here. So I have one site, one Drupal database, one Drupal instance, and it's running a Drupal site and a Pattern Lab. So this is the Pattern Lab structure. You know, for folks familiar, it breaks everything out into atoms, molecules, organisms. Let's see, let's look at, so you have like all your text styles, and then like you have fully built pages that include those styles throughout. One thing people enjoy about it is because it does have these responsive tools, like that's fun, right? And even more fun, it'll do it itself. Whee! So both these sites are consuming the same CSS as I said. Looking at the code a little bit, so I have a Drupal site inside my themes folder. Is that helpful? No. My theme is called BRB. Inside the source of BRB is the Pattern Lab. And like I said, there's a public folder and a source folder where I do all the work. I also have my standard Drupal templates, and I'll talk about them more in a second. Inside the source folder, there's a folder called _patterns that contains atoms, molecules, organisms, templates, pages. those can be renamed to anything you want. You can see that they match what is on the site itself. If I were to change this folder name from molecules to Zakiya's Awesome Molecules, and that header at the top would turn to Zakiya's Awesome Molecules. And then inside our subfolders, which group the next level down, and then you have the very specific component that you're talking about. Okay, so let's change some of our CSS and see what happens, just so we have, so I can prove that I'm not lying. So let's just change this font size to 25. Let's do 35. And I'm just focusing on the main menu. And okay, so they auto-reloaded. Oh, I wasn't on the, let me show all. This is all the patterns, right? Uh-oh, where's my menu? Oh, because I'm not, my menu gets hidden. Full size. So there's my links. Let me do that again so it's, you can see, I'll change them to 15 and save. And you see both pages reloaded. Oh yeah, there we go. And now, so both got updated at the same time. And because this is my local and I'm using browser sync, it all happens like instantaneously, both spots. Where that all happens is in the gulp file. We're using a lot of token or variables to define this, but basically if you make a change to either a twig file or a CSS file, the gulp generates the CSS, generates the JavaScript, and then runs this pattern lab generate command. So if you're using someone else's or a third-party tool, there's something analogous happening, right? It may not be in a gulp file. It might be like straight up commands that are custom scripted, but somewhere along the way, JavaScript and CSS are being put in the right place, and the pattern lab is being regenerated, usually on a watch command. Okay, so let's look at the menu specifically. I'll close these two. So I have, so this is the twig file that is part of the pattern library. So if you can see, when am I supposed to stop? 4:30? Up here, this is in the theme, source, pattern lab, source, patterns, atoms, global, a menu demo file, which corresponds to here. Let's take that off, that's annoying. It's a molecule called navigation. No, sorry, it's an atom. Menu demo. So that's it isolated, and in context, it's just this first one called menu demo. That title, menu demo, comes from the title of my file, right? And its placement is in relationship to the folders that surround it. Hope that makes sense. So this file is got a lot in it right now. You wouldn't get this by default. This is, I think, like copied and modified from one of the other Pattern Lab projects, which is where I got it from. But I'm using this particular one because it's sort of an example of like the worst case scenario for like the difficulty of dealing with Pattern Lab and Drupal. Like most patterns are super simple, like just like an li tag or a image tag or a just a button tag. But with menus, because their structure is so complicated and it has to be generated, you kind of need a lot of logic to make them work the way they look in Drupal. You could very easily have a UL and like 3 LIs, and it would look like a menu. But for it to have the same properties as the Drupal menu is going to have, it needs a lot more attention. So So a little bit of what's going on here. So just to illustrate, so this is just a twig file, which for my title. So if I did that, sorry, I need to wait for it to generate. Then, oops, was I in the wrong file? Oh yeah, because it's getting imported. Both of them have my title because I have imported this Pattern Lab twig file into the Drupal twig file that Drupal consumes, right? So they're both getting, they're both showing the same thing. So that's what this include statement does. But if I wanted to use a title that came from Drupal in there, like, because the Pattern Lab doesn't know any of Drupal's data inherently, unless you want to, that's a very different way of setting it up. Inherently, it doesn't know anything about Drupal's data. All the data it's getting is either from the JSON file that's directly in the same folder that it is with this exact same name. So that's what's actually feeding where those item names are coming from. Link 1, link 2, link 3. Or it's getting them from the master data list for the whole site, right? So to show that a little more clearly, if I change in my Pattern Lab template, instead of using something I specifically typed, if I use the title like just a variable, for the Pattern Lab, it's getting the title Pattern Lab because that's what's set in the Pattern Lab's data.json file. If I change the a menu demo JSON file and included a title variable, oh, and it needs to regenerate. Let me just do something to make it regenerate. Then this one has my title, but Drupal doesn't know anything about that piece of data, right? So, but if I want to get some data from Drupal into this template, I would leave this as title, and then in my Drupal template, my Drupal twig file, instead of doing it this way, let's, I'm gonna skip a step because I'm running on time. You'll just have to trust me if I hinted that there's a variable called menu name on the variable, and I wanted to use that title, like any variable from Drupal, then in my include I use this with key, and this works for any template. Like this is a twig thing, this isn't a Pattern Lab thing or a Drupal thing. Then I can use Drupal's variable in order to generate this information. This is what I do for trying to memorize stuff. I forget. Let's see. Menu dot name. Nope. Okay. I am going to have to twig. So it should be menu underscore name.
You don't need those extra brackets.
Ah, wait, oh, yeah. Thank you. Anything else? Okay, so the menu's name is main, so it's pulling that instead, my pattern lab has its my title, but now we're using Drupal data to actually populate the Drupal site. That's why this menu has about, blog, and home, even though it's using the same template as the pattern lab, and the pattern lab template has the stuff from data.json, which is link 1, link 2, link 3. Okay, that's enough of that. Cool. Did I show all the things? Yes. Okay. That brings me to the hard problems. So these are just the things to keep in mind if you're gonna go down this route with any Drupal pattern lab thing. Creating the JSON or the YAML files, Pattern Lab will accept one, just pick one, whichever one you prefer. The dummy data can be tedious, so I'll show you a plugin that helps with that, which is cool, but it's a thing I didn't expect when I first started using Pattern Lab, and not fun. And then dealing with Drupal render arrays, view modes, etc. Pattern Lab doesn't have any of those concepts, so making them match and making them play together, something to be considered. Oh yeah, I wanted to show the value module. Sorry. No, not sorry. This is actually more important than Pattern Lab. So this module was made by a coworker. It was just released a month or two ago. And this is, so how it's really hard to discover data and or find your variables or figure out what actual function you need to use in order to get the one thing you need from a Drupal site or a Drupal variable. This module will help you find it. So if you try to print the body summary without the surrounding field formatter, right? It's so you just want the data that's in the body summary. You don't want its surrounding. Then this is my Drupal twig file. Or sorry, I'm going to use the node file. No. So in order to do that, in the traditional way, you would probably do a Kint statement to try to get the data, and then you would be content.body.0.text maybe. They're digging through that array. Hopefully people have had this experience and know it sucks. But if you use the value module, you get a helper variable, in this case article, because this is an article that I'm looking at. And and this works with any fieldable entity, so you get these shortcuts, basically shortcut variables. So if I look for body, then summary is right there. This one has no summary, so it wouldn't have printed anything. But body value, so you get it without its wrapper very easily. And so that works for. You can think of the myriad of times where you're working with a field, especially a field that has multiple values where you've had to do this. The value module will help you out. And the reason why he wrote this is because he was working on a pattern library and was sick of the variable discovery part of the process. So I definitely recommend it. I hope more people like it, get to use it, submit, if there are problems, submit patches, etc. But for us front enders, we've been really happy to have it. So back to what else? So another thing to consider before you jump into this space is matching your markup, the markup that Drupal generates through its render arrays, to the markup that you're creating in your pattern library, which is usually quite simple, usually just a button tag or something very basic, is difficult. The things that are the hardest are form inputs and menus, because they're both so complex. Drupal does a lot of logic to generate those menus and to generate a lot of simplification in order to generate form inputs. So just know that that's going to be. Well, actually, I would encourage you to look at how other pattern libraries solve that if you're doing this for the first time before you jump in. But it is not just dead simple, maybe creating a button style or something like that. The other hard problem is feature parity. Drupal, it makes you appreciate Drupal, right? Drupal has a lot of functions, filters for Twig, and other little development helpers that Pattern Lab does not have by default. Most useful for me is using attributes, like the attributes object in order to add classes and remove classes and all that. Pattern Lab does not have them by default. There's some substitutes that are close but don't quite do it. You won't have Kint in your Pattern Lab by default. You don't have debug. You can turn on debug, but you don't. It's not as lovely as Kint. You might be able. I think you can use var_dumper, Symfony's var_dumper. Pattern Lab doesn't have the concept of libraries that Drupal does, right? So the specifically including assets based on what is actually on the page works differently in Pattern Lab than it does in Drupal. So you have to decide like how are you going to reconcile those things. And then there's a bunch of just like other macros, filters, and functions. The other one that's sort of a big like oh no is Drupal has a lot of JavaScript that's built into it. So you can either in your Pattern Lab disable all or in your Drupal site disable all Pattern Lab to make sure that the exact same JavaScript is running in both instances, or you find a way to get your Drupal JavaScript into your Pattern Lab. And so it kind of depends on how much of that Drupal JavaScript you actually want to use, how that goes down. But it is something to consider. It's like not a there's definitely one right way to do this kind of thing. Fourth hard problem, organization. You definitely want to put some effort in the beginning to consistently reference things because Pattern Lab is flexible. You do have to find a way to be opinionated about it. Your helper functions like source and active theme directory will work in Drupal but not in Pattern Lab, so you have to figure out how you're going to be consistent. Images, all the coupled projects have an images question, same one, it happens with Pattern Lab, or you could punt on it. Like I said, the contributor projects have mostly considered the hard problem, but even if you do use one of those contrib problems, you probably at some point are going to have to understand them yourself if you're doing this work. So the plugins are super important. There's a couple on that list that I gave. Just use them. Clean class, you want it. T function, you want it. These are Drupal twig components. The plugin data transform, just use it because it just simplifies things. There's a plugin called PHP Faker, which will generate dummy text for you, so you don't have to do it yourself. That's really useful. Twig namespaces, just use it. You can put templates use it if you want to put your pattern somewhere besides the /patterns folder, which it kind of depends on what you're trying to do. There's an add attributes twig extension that tries to emulate Drupal's attributes object, but it is not the same. There's a BEM twig extension if BEM is your jam. And then there's unified twig extensions, which I have not used, which says that it will allow your custom Pattern Lab function. So if you write a custom PHP function for Pattern Lab, it will then be reusable into your Drupal templates. Haven't used that one. Sounds good, like a good idea. More to come. So I have no big finish, except for the words big finish. That was a lot, and I think that, Pattern Lab's a really cool tool, and integrating with Drupal is fun in some ways, but I think go in with eyes open. There's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot to consume all at once. It's really hard to explain. It was one of the hardest sessions I've ever had to put together because it's everything's coming from everywhere, and it's really hard to tell people where. So yeah, that's it. Are there? Are there any questions before everyone scurries back to their regular lives? Yeah.
That value module, have you found that useful in traversing the media entities?
Yeah. So yeah. So the site that I used it on did not have a ton of stuff going on with media entities, but it should work. It's the same.
I've had night-long fever dreams about it.
Well, let us, seriously, Arshad, he lives in Africa. He doesn't get to come to any Drupal events, and so he doesn't get feedback. He's just hey, chapter 3, I think you should use this, and it's up to us to let him know whether it's doing the right thing or submit a patch or, So I think it should help you. Yeah.
There's another similar module called twig field value that also helps with some of that ending.
Yeah, there's a couple. Yeah, there's twig field value. There's twig tweaks, and there's like one other one. Yeah, that that you should use all of them. They all do different things, but yeah, cool. All right, congratulations, your bad camp is over. I survived.